Flight 447 was supposed to be a routine journey from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. The Boeing 737 carried 178 passengers and crew members on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Among the travelers sat Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old tomb guard from Arlington National Cemetery, heading home to visit his sick mother after completing his honor guard duty. Marcus had spent 3 years standing watch over the tomb of the unknown soldier, where discipline, precision, and unwavering focus were not just expectations but a way of life. The rigorous training had shaped him into someone who remained calm under pressure, thought clearly in chaos, and never abandoned his post when others needed him. As the plane reached its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, passengers settled into their usual routines. Some dozed off, others watched movies on their tablets, and a few worked on laptops. The flight attendants moved through the aisles serving drinks and snacks with practiced smiles. Everything appeared normal until a sharp smell began drifting through the cabin. At first, it was barely noticeable. A passenger in row 12 wrinkled her nose and looked around confused. Then others began to smell it too. The scent was acrid, like burning plastic mixed with something metallic. Flight attendant Sarah Rodriguez noticed passengers becoming restless and decided to investigate. She walked toward the back of the plane, following the smell, which grew stronger with each step. Her training kicked in as she methodically checked the overhead bins and examined the cabin for any signs of trouble. The smell was definitely coming from somewhere behind the passenger area. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain James Wilson and First Officer Lisa Chen were reviewing their flight path when a yellow warning light flickered on the instrument panel. Wilson frowned and tapped the light, hoping it was just a minor electrical glitch. But within seconds, more warning lights began illuminating across the dashboard like a deadly Christmas tree. The smell in the cabin was now unmistakable. Several passengers started coughing, and children began crying as their parents tried to reassure them that everything was fine. But Marcus Thompson knew better. His military training had taught him to recognize the signs of danger, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was seriously wrong. A flight attendant rushed past his seat toward the cockpit, her face pale and worried. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, scanning the cabin. The smell was getting stronger, and he could see wisps of smoke beginning to curl from the air vents near the rear of the plane. That's when the first scream pierced the air. A woman in the back row pointed toward the wall behind her seat, where orange flames were now visible through a small gap in the interior paneling. The fire was inside the plane's structure, feeding on wiring and insulation, growing stronger by the second. Panic erupted instantly. Passengers jumped from their seats, pushing toward the front of the plane. Parents grabbed their children, elderly travelers struggled to move, and the narrow aisle became a chaotic bottleneck of terrified people. The professional calm that had defined the flight just moments earlier evaporated into pure survival instinct. Flight attendants tried desperately to maintain order, shouting instructions over the growing noise, but their voices were drowned out by screams and crying. The plane's fire suppression system activated, filling the cabin with a fine mist. But everyone could see that the flames were spreading faster than the system could contain them. In the cockpit, alarms were blaring constantly. Captain Wilson's hands moved quickly across the controls as he tried to understand what was happening to his aircraft. The fire detection system showed multiple alerts throughout the plane's electrical systems. This wasn't just a small malfunction. This was a catastrophic failure that threatened everyone on board. "We need to declare an emergency," First Officer Chen said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. She was already reaching for the radio to contact air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Wilson spoke into his headset. "This is Flight 447. We have an onboard fire and need immediate clearance to the nearest airport. We're beginning emergency descent." The plane lurched as Wilson pushed the nose down, beginning a rapid descent that would bring them closer to the ground and hopefully to safety. But they were still hundreds of miles from the nearest suitable airport, and everyone on board knew that time was running out. In the passenger cabin, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The fire had spread to multiple sections of the plane's interior, and thick black smoke was beginning to fill the air. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, but many passengers were too panicked to put them on properly. Marcus Thompson looked around at the chaos surrounding him and made a decision that would change everything. His years of military discipline, his training as a tomb guard, and his deep sense of duty to protect others all converged in that moment. While everyone else was focused on their own survival, Marcus began moving toward the source of the fire. The flight attendants were overwhelmed. The pilots were fighting to control the aircraft, and the passengers were consumed by fear. Someone needed to take charge of the situation in the cabin, and Marcus Thompson realized that someone was going to be him. As he pushed against the flow of panicking passengers, moving toward the rear of the burning plane instead of away from it, Marcus had no idea that his actions in the next few minutes would determine whether 178 people lived or died that day. Marcus Thompson moved through the panicked crowd like a man with a mission. His military bearing and calm demeanor began to cut through the chaos around him. As he reached the back of the plane where the fire was strongest, he could see that flames had broken through the wall paneling and were spreading across the ceiling. The heat was intense, and the smoke was getting thicker by the minute. Most passengers were now pressed toward the front of the aircraft, leaving the rear section nearly empty, except for a few elderly passengers who couldn't move quickly, and a mother with 2 small children who seemed frozen with terror. "Ma'am, you need to move forward now," Marcus told the mother firmly but kindly. He helped gather her children and guided them toward the front of the plane. The elderly passengers needed more assistance, so Marcus quickly recruited 2 younger men who had been standing nearby watching helplessly. "I need your help," he told them with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Help me get these people to safety." Something in his voice made them respond immediately, and together they began moving the vulnerable passengers away from the fire. Meanwhile, Flight attendant Sarah Rodriguez was trying to reach the emergency fire equipment stored in the rear galley, but the flames were blocking her path. She could see the fire extinguishers just 20 feet away, but there was no safe way to reach them through the wall of fire and smoke. Marcus noticed her struggle and approached her. "I can get through there," he said, studying the flames. His training had included fire safety and emergency response, and he could see a narrow path along the floor where the smoke was lighter, and the flames hadn't yet spread. "It's too dangerous," Sarah protested. "You could be killed." "Everyone on this plane will be killed if we don't try," Marcus replied simply. He pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth and dropped to the floor, beginning to crawl toward the galley through the smoky passage. The heat was overwhelming, and Marcus could feel his skin burning from the radiant heat of the flames above him. His eyes watered from the smoke, making it nearly impossible to see, but he kept moving forward. Behind him, he could hear Sarah coordinating with other flight attendants to form a human chain to pass the fire extinguishers forward once he reached them. As Marcus crawled through the inferno, Captain Wilson was fighting his own battle in the cockpit. The fire had damaged critical electrical systems, and several of his instruments were no longer functioning. The plane was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and he could feel it wanting to roll to one side as the fire damaged the control cables. "Denver approach. This is Flight 447, First Officer Chen radioed. "We have lost multiple systems due to onboard fire. We need vectors to the nearest airport immediately. Souls on board 178, fuel remaining approximately 45 minutes. Flight 447, Denver approach. We have you on radar. Turn left heading 180. Descend and maintain 15,000 feet. Denver International is 47 miles southeast of your position. Emergency crews are standing by." Wilson struggled with the controls as he attempted the turn. The plane was responding sluggishly, and he could feel the fire's effects spreading throughout the aircraft's systems. They were in a race against time, and time was winning. Back in the cabin, Marcus had reached the galley and was grabbing fire extinguishers with his burned hands. The pain was excruciating, but he pushed through it, knowing that giving up meant everyone would die. He passed the first extinguisher back to Sarah, then grabbed a second one. The human chain worked efficiently, passing the equipment forward to other crew members who began attacking the fire from multiple angles. But even as they fought the flames, everyone could see that the fire was spreading faster than they could contain it. "We need to create a fire break," Marcus shouted over the noise. He had learned about fire suppression tactics during his military training, and he knew they needed to deny the fire fuel to burn. "We need to remove everything flammable from this area." Working together, passengers and crew began stripping seat cushions, blankets, and anything else that could burn from the area around the fire. They created a cleared zone, hoping to slow the fire's advance toward the front of the plane where most of the passengers were now huddled. The work was dangerous and exhausting. The smoke was so thick that people could barely breathe even with oxygen masks. Several passengers collapsed from smoke inhalation and had to be carried to clearer air near the front of the cabin. Marcus organized teams of volunteers to take turns fighting the fire, ensuring that no one stayed in the toxic environment too long. His leadership during the crisis was natural and effective, and people responded to his calm commands even in their terror. But despite their efforts, the fire continued to spread. The plane's interior was designed with fire-resistant materials, but the intensity of the electrical fire was overwhelming their defenses. Worse, the fire was now affecting the plane's structure itself, weakening the aircraft from the inside. Captain Wilson could feel the plane becoming less stable with each passing minute. The control surfaces were not responding properly, and he was having to use more and more force to keep the aircraft level. He knew they were rapidly approaching the point where the plane would become uncontrollable. "How much time do we have?" he asked First Officer Chen. She looked at their instruments and calculated quickly. "At our current rate of descent and distance to Denver, maybe 12 minutes. But if we lose any more control systems..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both pilots knew that if the fire damaged any more critical systems, 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours. They would never make it to the airport. In the cabin, Marcus could see that their firefighting efforts, while slowing the fire, were not going to be enough. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the smoke was so thick that visibility was nearly zero in the rear of the plane. They needed a different strategy, and they needed it now. Marcus Thompson realized they were losing the battle against the fire. The flames had consumed nearly a third of the passenger cabin, and the smoke was becoming deadly. People in the front of the plane were starting to suffer from smoke inhalation, and several passengers had already lost consciousness. Standing in the aisle, his uniform singed and his hands burned, Marcus made a decision that went against every survival instinct. Instead of moving to the safer front section of the plane with everyone else, he turned and walked back toward the fire. "Where are you going?" Sarah Rodriguez called after him. "It's not safe back there." "I need to see something," Marcus replied, pulling his torn shirt tighter around his face. He had noticed something during their firefighting efforts that might give them a chance, but he needed to get closer to confirm his suspicions. The heat was overwhelming as he approached the fire's source. Through the smoke and flames, Marcus could see that the fire had burned through to the aircraft's outer skin in one small area. The metal was glowing red-hot, but it had created a small hole about the size of a dinner plate. This gave him an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Marcus returned to where the flight attendants were, coordinating the firefighting efforts. "I need everyone to listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his military training. "We're going to create a controlled breach in the fuselage to vent the smoke and starve the fire of oxygen." The flight attendants stared at him in shock. "You want to put a hole in the plane?" Sarah asked incredulously. "That could cause explosive decompression." "The fire has already started a hole," Marcus explained quickly. "We're at 15,000 feet now, not 30,000. The pressure difference won't be as severe. If we can create a controlled vent, we can pull the smoke and heat out of the cabin, and the reduced oxygen will slow the fire." It was an enormous risk. If the hole was too large or if they were still too high, the decompression could be catastrophic. But if they did nothing, everyone would die from smoke inhalation long before they reached Denver. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom, strained and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are 8 minutes from landing. Please remain in your seats and follow all crew instructions." 8 minutes. Marcus knew they didn't have 8 minutes unless they did something. "Drastic right now. I need tools," he told Sarah. "Anything we can use to enlarge that hole in a controlled way." The flight attendants quickly gathered what they could find. A fire axe. From the emergency equipment, some metal serving utensils from the galley, anything that could be used to carefully expand the opening the fire had created. Marcus recruited several of the stronger passengers to help him. "We're going to work in 30-second shifts," he explained. "The heat back there will overwhelm you quickly. When I say switch, you come out immediately and let the next person take over." The plan was dangerous for everyone involved, but the alternative was certain death. Working in rapid shifts, the volunteers began carefully enlarging the hole in the aircraft's skin, while Marcus coordinated their efforts and monitored their safety. The first volunteer, A construction worker named Dave managed to enlarge the opening slightly before the heat forced him to retreat. The second person, a woman who worked as a mechanic, made more progress before she too had to back away, coughing and gasping. As each person worked, Marcus could see his theory was correct. Air was being pulled through the hole, carrying smoke and heat with it. The fire was still burning, but its growth had slowed as the oxygen in the immediate area was reduced. But the work was taking too long, and the volunteers were being overcome by the heat and smoke faster than they could make progress. Marcus realized he would have to take the biggest risk himself. "I'm going to make one sustained effort," he told Sarah. "I need you to time me. If I'm not back in 2 minutes, send someone in to pull me out." Before she could protest, Marcus grabbed the fire axe and disappeared into the smoke and flames. The heat was like walking into a furnace, and he could feel his skin blistering even through his clothes. His lungs burned with each breath, and his eyes streamed tears that evaporated almost instantly. Working with desperate efficiency, Marcus used the axe to carefully expand the hole. Each swing had to be precise. Too small and it wouldn't be effective, too large and it could cause structural failure. His military training in demolitions helped him understand how to weaken the metal without compromising the plane's integrity. Sparks flew as the axe struck the heated metal, and Marcus could feel himself becoming lightheaded from the heat and smoke. His vision was starting to blur, and he knew he was reaching the limits of what his body could endure. Just as he was about to collapse, Marcus felt arms grabbing him and pulling him back from the fire. Dave and 2 other volunteers had come in after him, ignoring their own safety to rescue him from the inferno. As they dragged him to safety, Marcus could see that his plan was working. The hole was now large enough to create a significant draft, and smoke was being pulled out of the cabin at a rapid rate. The fire was still burning, but it was no longer spreading as quickly. 5 minutes to landing, Captain Wilson announced over the intercom, his voice tense with concentration. In the cockpit, Wilson was fighting to keep the damaged aircraft under control. The fire had damaged hydraulic lines, making the plane increasingly difficult to steer. First Officer Chen was running through emergency checklists, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a very challenging landing. "Denver Tower, Flight 447 is on final approach," Chen radioed. "We have major structural damage from onboard fire. Request crash and rescue standing by. Flight 447, Denver Tower. All emergency equipment is in position. You are cleared to land runway 34 right. Wind is calm." In the cabin, Marcus was organizing the passengers for the emergency landing. Despite his injuries, he moved through the aisles, ensuring everyone was in the proper brace position and that all loose items were secured. The hole in the fuselage had dramatically improved conditions in the cabin, but they weren't safe yet. The fire was still burning. The plane was badly damaged, and they were about to attempt a landing that even under normal circumstances would be extremely dangerous. The approach to Denver International Airport was unlike anything Captain Wilson had experienced in his 20-year flying career. The aircraft was fighting him at every control input, and several critical systems were either damaged or completely offline. The fire had weakened the plane's structure, and he could feel it flexing in ways that no aircraft should flex. "Hydraulics are failing," First Officer Chen reported, her voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We've lost primary flight controls. Switching to backup systems." Wilson gripped the controls tighter, using all his strength to keep the plane on the proper approach path. Through the cockpit windscreen, he could see the airport ahead, surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment lined the runway, ready for whatever was about to happen. In the passenger cabin, Marcus Thompson was making final preparations for the emergency landing. Despite his burns and smoke inhalation, he moved methodically through the aircraft, checking that every passenger was properly positioned and prepared for impact. "Keep your heads down and stay in the brace position until we come to a complete stop," he instructed each row of passengers. His calm demeanor was helping to keep panic at bay, even as the plane shuddered and groaned around them. The fire in the rear of the aircraft was still burning, but the controlled breach Marcus had created was continuing to vent smoke and heat. The air in the cabin was still thick and acrid, but it was breathable, and the fire's spread had been significantly slowed. Sarah Rodriguez and the other flight attendants were positioned throughout the cabin, ready to coordinate the evacuation the moment the plane stopped. They had reviewed the emergency procedures multiple times during the descent, knowing that they would have only minutes to get everyone off the aircraft once they were on the ground. 3 minutes to touchdown, Wilson announced over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. The plane was descending too quickly, but Wilson had no choice. The damaged control surfaces weren't responding properly, and he was running out of altitude to make corrections. He could see the runway rushing up toward them, and he knew this was going to be a very hard landing. Marcus strapped himself into an empty seat near the middle of the aircraft, positioning himself where he could quickly assist with the evacuation. Around him, passengers were crying, praying, and holding hands with strangers. The terror was palpable, but there was also a sense of determination. They had survived the fire, and now they just had to survive the landing. 1 minute to touchdown, Wilson called out. Brace for impact. The plane hit the runway hard, much harder than a normal landing. The impact sent a shockwave through the aircraft, and Marcus could hear metal creaking and groaning under the stress. The landing gear held, but the plane was bouncing and veering to one side as Wilson fought to maintain control. Sparks flew from the damaged aircraft as it scraped along the runway. The speed was still too high, and Wilson could see that they were rapidly running out of runway. He applied maximum brakes, but the plane was heavy and damaged, and it wasn't slowing down quickly enough. We're not going to stop in time, Chen said, watching their speed and calculating the distance remaining. Wilson made a split-second decision that probably saved everyone's lives. Instead of trying to stay on the runway, he deliberately steered the plane onto the grass beside the runway. The soft ground would help slow them down, even though it would likely cause the landing gear to collapse. The plane plowed into the grass at over 100 miles per hour. The landing gear immediately collapsed, and the aircraft skidded along on its belly, throwing up clouds of dirt and debris. Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown around despite their seatbelts, and the noise was tremendous. Marcus felt the plane sliding sideways, then spinning slightly as it slowed. Emergency oxygen masks that had been knocked loose during the fire were now flying around the cabin, and several overhead bins broke open, spilling luggage everywhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the aircraft came to a stop. For a moment, there was complete silence except for the sound of the fire still crackling in the rear of the plane. Is everyone okay? Marcus called out, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up. Around the cabin, passengers were slowly lifting their heads and checking themselves for injuries. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom one last time. Evacuate! 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 This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for throughout the entire crisis. He moved immediately to the nearest emergency exit and began helping passengers escape from the damaged aircraft. The evacuation slides had deployed automatically, and people were sliding down to safety as quickly as possible. Leave everything behind, Marcus instructed passengers who were trying to grab their luggage. Just get out of the plane now. The fire in the rear of the aircraft was growing stronger now that they were on the ground, and no longer had the benefit of the controlled venting system Marcus had created at altitude. Smoke was beginning to fill the cabin again, and everyone could see flames beginning to spread forward. Sarah Rodriguez and the other flight attendants were directing passengers to different exits to avoid bottlenecks. Their training was evident as they remained calm and organized even as the situation became increasingly urgent. Marcus was helping an elderly man toward an exit when he heard a cry from the back of the plane. A woman was trapped in her seat. Her seatbelt had jammed during the rough landing and she couldn't get free. The fire was only a few rows behind her and spreading quickly. Without hesitation, Marcus ran toward the fire, not away from it. He reached the trapped woman just as the heat was becoming unbearable. Her seatbelt mechanism had been damaged in the landing, and no amount of pulling would release it. Marcus pulled out a small knife from his military gear and quickly cut through the seatbelt webbing. "Can you walk?" he asked the woman, who was semi-conscious from smoke inhalation. When she didn't respond, Marcus lifted her over his shoulder and began carrying her toward the exit. Behind them, the fire was consuming the seats where she had been trapped just moments before. Marcus Thompson carried the unconscious woman through the smoke-filled cabin as flames consumed the seats behind them. His burned hands screamed in pain and his lungs felt like they were on fire, but he kept moving toward the emergency exit. Every step was a battle against the toxic air that filled his throat and nose. The heat from the growing fire was intense enough to melt plastic trim around the windows. Marcus could hear the metal structure of the plane creaking and groaning as the fire weakened its supports. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire rear section would be consumed. When he reached the emergency exit, flight attendant Sarah Rodriguez was there to help. Together, they guided the unconscious woman onto the evacuation slide and sent her down to waiting rescue personnel. Marcus watched her slide to safety, then turned back toward the cabin. "That's everyone," Sarah told him. "You need to get out now." But Marcus wasn't satisfied. His military training had taught him to never leave anyone behind, and he needed to be absolutely certain the plane was empty. "I'm doing one final sweep," he told her. "Go, get out now." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded and evacuated down the slide. Marcus was now alone in the burning aircraft with the fire spreading rapidly toward him. Moving quickly but carefully, he checked every row of seats, looking under debris for anyone who might have been thrown from their seat during the rough landing. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, and the heat was becoming unbearable. His clothes were starting to smolder from the radiant heat of the fire. In the front of the plane, he found Captain Wilson and First Officer Chen still in the cockpit, shutting down systems and securing the aircraft. "You need to get out," Marcus told them. "The fire is spreading fast." "Just finishing the emergency shutdown," Wilson replied, his hands moving quickly across switches and controls. "Can't leave the aircraft with live electrical systems." Marcus understood. Even in this crisis, the pilots were following their training and responsibilities. But he could see flames beginning to appear in the ceiling above them. 30 seconds, he told them. "Then I'm dragging you out." Wilson nodded and accelerated his shutdown procedures. Chen was gathering the flight data recorder and other critical information that investigators would need. 25 seconds later, they were done. The three of them ran toward the emergency exit as the fire began consuming the cockpit behind them. Marcus went first down the slide, followed by Chen, then Wilson. They hit the ground just as the first section of the plane's roof collapsed from the fire damage. Outside, the scene was controlled chaos. Fire trucks were spraying foam on the burning aircraft while paramedics treated injured passengers. Most of the injuries were minor, smoke inhalation, cuts, and bruises from the rough landing, but several people were in serious condition. Marcus looked around at the 178 people scattered across the grass beside the runway. Every single person who had been on that plane was alive. Burns covered his hands and arms, his uniform was destroyed, and he could barely speak from smoke inhalation, but everyone had survived. Emergency medical personnel immediately surrounded Marcus, trying to treat his injuries, but he waved them off. "Take care of the others first," he said hoarsely. "I'm fine." "Sir, you have second-degree burns and severe smoke inhalation," a paramedic insisted. "You need immediate medical attention." Marcus looked back at the burning plane, then at the survivors being treated around him. Only then did he allow himself to be led to an ambulance for treatment. As paramedics cleaned and bandaged his burns, Marcus watched the firefighters battle the blaze that was consuming the aircraft. The plane was a total loss, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that every person who had been aboard was breathing, talking, crying, hugging their families, and going home. Captain Wilson appeared beside the ambulance, his face covered in soot but otherwise uninjured. "I've been flying for 20 years, he told Marcus, "and I've never seen anything like what you did in there. You saved everyone on that plane." Marcus shook his head. "We all saved each other. You got us to the ground, the flight attendants kept everyone calm. The passengers helped fight the fire. It was everyone working together. But Wilson wasn't having it. That controlled breach you created, that was the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. And going back for that woman, doing the final sweep, that's not something most people would do." Word of Marcus's actions was already spreading among the survivors and rescue personnel. Passengers were asking to meet the soldier who had taken charge during the crisis. Flight attendants were describing his leadership to investigators and reporters, who were beginning to arrive at the scene. Sarah Rodriguez found Marcus as he was, being loaded into an ambulance for transport to the hospital. "I wanted to thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "I've been flying for 8 years, and I thought I knew how to handle emergencies. But what you did in there, organizing everyone, creating that vent, keeping us all focused on saving lives instead of panicking, that's what saved us." Marcus tried to respond, but his voice was gone from the smoke. He simply nodded and squeezed her hand with his bandaged fingers. As the ambulance pulled away from the crash site, Marcus could see through the rear window that the fire had now consumed the entire aircraft. The plane was destroyed, but scattered across the runway and grass were 178 people who would go home to their families that night because of the actions taken by a young tomb guard who refused to abandon his post, even when that post was a burning plane at 30,000 feet. The investigation would later show that the fire had been caused by a catastrophic electrical failure that should have killed everyone aboard. The only reason it didn't was because one man decided that his duty to protect others was more important than his own safety. 3 days after the crash, Marcus Thompson lay in a hospital bed at Denver General, his arms wrapped in bandages and his throat still raw from smoke inhalation. The room was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from people across the country who had heard about his actions aboard Flight 447. The story had spread rapidly through news media and social networks. Video footage from the airport security cameras showed the dramatic crash landing and evacuation, and passenger testimonies painted a clear picture of how Marcus had organized the firefighting efforts and evacuation that saved everyone's lives. But Marcus was uncomfortable with the attention. He had asked the hospital staff to limit visitors and media access, preferring to focus on recovering so he could return to his duties at Arlington National Cemetery. To him, what he had done wasn't heroic. It was simply what anyone in his position should have done. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the burn specialist treating Marcus, disagreed. "I've been treating burn victims for 15 years, she told him during her morning rounds. Most people with burns this severe got them trying to escape from fires, not running toward them. What you did was extraordinary." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "I just did what I was trained to do. The military teaches you to protect others, to never leave anyone behind. It wasn't heroism, it was duty." Dr. Santos studied his chart, noting that his burns were healing well and his lung function was improving. "Your burns should heal completely within a few weeks. But I'm concerned about the psychological impact. Have you experienced any nightmares or anxiety since the crash?" Marcus considered the question. He had been having vivid dreams about the fire, waking up feeling like he could still smell smoke. But he didn't think that was unusual given what he had experienced. "Some dreams," he admitted, "but nothing I can't handle." What he didn't tell Dr. Santos was that his dreams weren't about the fire or the crash. They were about the woman he had rescued, about Captain Wilson and First Officer Chen, about all the passengers who had looked to him for leadership in those terrifying minutes. In his dreams, he failed them. In his dreams, people died because he wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or smart enough to save them. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Rodriguez, the flight attendant, entered carrying a small gift bag. Her face lit up when she saw that Marcus was awake. "How are you feeling?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "Better every day," Marcus replied. "How are you?" "How is everyone else?" Sarah smiled. "Everyone is doing well. A few people are still being treated for smoke inhalation, but the doctors expect full recoveries. The woman you carried out, Mrs. Patterson, she wants to meet you when you're feeling better." "She says she owes you her life." Marcus shook his head. "She doesn't owe me anything. I was just doing my job." "That's what makes you special," Sarah said. "You don't see what you did as special. But I was there, Marcus. I saw how you took control when everything was falling apart. You organized the firefighting efforts. You created that vent that saved us all, and you went back for Mrs. Patterson when no one else would have." She pulled a small wrapped package from her gift bag. "This is from all the flight attendants on Flight 447. We wanted you to have something to remember that what you did mattered." Marcus unwrapped the package to find a small silver pin in the shape of wings, with an inscription that read, "To Guardian Angel Marcus Thompson. Thank you for bringing us all home. The crew of Flight 447. "It's beautiful," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Sarah stood to leave, then turned back. "There's something else you should know. The Federal Aviation Administration is conducting a full investigation of the crash, and they want to interview you about the controlled breach you created. They think your technique could be developed into official emergency procedures for similar situations." Marcus was surprised. "I thought I might get in trouble for damaging the aircraft. Are you kidding?" Sarah laughed. "You probably saved the aviation industry millions of dollars in lawsuits, not to mention 178 lives. They want to study what you did so they can teach it to other crews." After Sarah left, Marcus stared at the ceiling and thought about the investigation. He had acted on instinct and military training, but apparently his actions were being analyzed by experts who thought they had broader applications. The idea that his desperate improvisation might help save other people in similar situations gave him a sense of purpose beyond just doing his duty. The next visitor surprised him even more. Colonel James Harrison, Marcus's commanding officer from Arlington National Cemetery, entered the room in full dress uniform. Marcus immediately tried to sit up straighter, but the colonel motioned for him to remain comfortable. "At ease, Thompson," Colonel Harrison said, pulling up a chair. "I'm not here as your commanding officer. I'm here as someone who's proud to know you. Sir, I was just supposed to be on leave visiting my mother. I never intended to what? To save 178 lives? To demonstrate the highest ideals of military service while off duty?" The colonel smiled. "Thompson, what you did on that aircraft embodies everything we teach about honor, duty, and service before self. You've brought honor not just to yourself, but to the entire Guard." The colonel reached into his briefcase and pulled out an official-looking document. "The Army has decided to award you the Soldier's Medal for heroism, not involving actual conflict with an enemy. It's the highest award for heroism in a non-combat situation." Marcus stared at the citation, reading his own name on the official commendation. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. There's more." Colonel Harrison's expression became more serious. "The Secretary of the Army wants to meet with you when you're recovered. There's talk of a special assignment, possibly working with the FAA to develop new emergency response protocols based on what you did. I just want to get back to my post at the tomb, sir." "And you will. But Thompson, what you did has implications beyond just one incident. Your actions showed that military training and discipline can save civilian lives in ways we never anticipated. The Army wants to explore how we can better prepare our people for situations like this." That evening, Marcus's mother finally arrived from Los Angeles. She had been delayed by canceled flights in the aftermath of the crash, and seeing her son covered in bandages brought tears to her eyes. "When I heard about the plane crash and saw your name on the passenger list, I thought I'd lost you," she said, holding his uninjured hand tightly. "I'm okay. Mom, everyone's okay." "I know what you did," she said quietly. "I saw the news reports. Your father would have been so proud." Marcus's father had been a firefighter who died in the line of duty when Marcus was 12. The loss had shaped Marcus's decision to join the military and serve at the tomb of the unknown soldier, honoring those who had given their lives for others. "He used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching," Marcus's mother continued. "It's what he does when no one will ever know. But everyone knows what you did, and I've never been prouder to be your mother." As his mother held his hand, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. For 3 days, he had focused on his physical recovery and tried to downplay his actions. But listening to his mother, thinking about his father, and remembering the faces of the 178 people who had walked away from that burning plane, he began to understand that what had happened was indeed extraordinary. He had been trained to stand guard over the unknown soldiers who had given their lives for their country. On Flight 447, he had stood guard over 178 living people who needed protection. In both cases, he had simply refused to abandon his post, no matter how dangerous the situation became. 6 months after Flight 447, Marcus Thompson stood once again at his post at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as he began his 21-step march across the black mat. His movements precise and measured as they had been for the past 3 years. His hands had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that reminded him of that day above the clouds. His lungs were strong again and the nightmares had faded, but the experience had changed him in ways that went far deeper than physical recovery. The investigation into Flight 447 had concluded that Marcus's actions had indeed saved everyone aboard. The controlled breach technique he had improvised was now being studied by aviation safety experts and incorporated into emergency training protocols for flight crews around the world. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive had become a new standard for aircraft fire emergencies. The FAA had asked Marcus to consult on the development of these new procedures, and he had spent several weeks traveling to training facilities across the country, sharing his experience with pilots and flight attendants. He found it rewarding to know that his actions might help save other lives in the future, but it was here, at the tomb, where Marcus felt most at peace. The silence, the discipline, the honor of standing guard over those who had given everything for their country. This was where he belonged. As he completed his march and executed his turn, Marcus noticed a small group of visitors watching from behind the chains that marked the boundary of the ceremonial area. Among them was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, accompanied by a younger woman who looked familiar. After his shift ended, and he was relieved by the next guard, Marcus walked over to greet the visitors. The younger woman approached him with a warm smile. "Sergeant Thompson, I'm Jennifer Patterson. This is my grandmother, Dorothy Patterson. You saved her life on Flight 447. Marcus looked at the elderly woman in the wheelchair, recognizing her as the passenger he had carried from the burning plane. She reached out with a trembling hand, and Marcus gently took it in his own. "I wanted to come here to thank you properly," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft but strong. "My granddaughter told me you were a tomb guard, and I felt I needed to see where you serve." "Ma'am, you don't need to thank me. I was just doing what anyone would have done," Mrs. Patterson smiled. "That's not true, and you know it. Most people would have run toward the front of that plane, not toward the fire. You saved my life, and you saved everyone else's life, too." She pulled a small envelope from her purse. "I wrote you a letter, but I wanted to give it to you here, in this place that means so much to you." Marcus accepted the envelope. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished speaking. "My husband served in World War II. He's buried not far from here. He used to tell me that there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who run toward danger to help others and those who run away. He was the first kind, and so are you." After the Patterson family left, Marcus opened the letter. Inside was a handwritten note that brought tears to his eyes. "Dear Marcus, you will never know how many lives you touched that day. Not just the 178 people on the plane, but all of our families, our children and grandchildren who will exist because you refused to give up. My husband died in the war fighting for strangers he would never meet. You saved strangers you had never met. You are both heroes, and I wanted you to know that your courage will ripple through generations. Thank you for bringing me home to my family. With eternal gratitude, Dorothy Patterson." That evening, Marcus received a phone call from Captain Wilson. The pilot had returned to flying and wanted to update Marcus on some of the other survivors. "Sarah Rodriguez got promoted to lead flight attendant," Wilson reported. "She credits you with teaching her how to lead in a crisis. And that construction worker, Dave, who helped you with the breach? He started volunteering with the local fire department. Says you inspired him to help people in emergencies." Wilson paused before continuing. "You know, I've thought a lot about that day. What struck me wasn't just your courage, but your ability to see solutions when everyone else only saw problems. That controlled breach idea, that was brilliant. But more than that, you gave everyone hope when we all thought we were going to die." Marcus appreciated the update, but he was more interested in how Captain Wilson was coping with the experience. "How are you doing, Captain? That was a hell of a landing you made." "I'm good. Better than good, actually. What happened that day reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. It wasn't for the routine flights or the perfect weather days. It was for the moment when people's lives depend on your training and your decisions. You reminded all of us what it means to serve others." A year later, Marcus was promoted to Sergeant of the Guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the highest position available to an enlisted soldier at the memorial. The promotion came with additional responsibilities, including training new guards and representing the Army at ceremonies and events. During his promotion ceremony, attended by survivors from Flight 447, Marcus reflected on how the experience had shaped his understanding of service. Standing guard at the tomb had taught him discipline, honor, and respect for sacrifice, but Flight 447 had taught him that those principles weren't confined to military service. They applied anywhere. People needed protection and leadership. The story of Flight 447 became part of the training curriculum at multiple military schools, not as an example of heroism, but as a demonstration of how military training could be applied to civilian emergencies. Marcus occasionally received letters from young soldiers who had heard the story and been inspired to think beyond traditional military roles. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The families of the unknown soldiers buried at Arlington wrote a letter to the Army, stating that Marcus had demonstrated the same selfless service that their loved ones had shown. They requested that his actions be permanently recognized at the tomb. Today, visitors to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier can see a small plaque near the memorial that reads, "In honor of all who serve others in their moment of greatest need, military and civilian alike. Dedicated by the families of America's unknown heroes." Marcus Thompson continues to stand guard at the tomb, carrying with him the knowledge that service to others takes many forms. Whether standing in silent vigil over fallen heroes or fighting fires in a burning aircraft at 30,000 feet, the principles remain the same. Never abandon your post, never leave anyone behind, and always put the welfare of others before your own. The tomb guard who saved Flight 447 had learned that heroism isn't about seeking recognition or glory. It's about doing what's right when everything goes wrong, and standing firm when others need you most. In the end, that's what both kinds of service, guarding the dead and saving the living, are really about.